The wind howls across the jagged cliffs, carrying a mixture of salt, smoke, and the acrid tang of burned timber, stinging the eyes and throat. You can barely see through the haze, yet every detail etches itself into your memory with a cruel clarity. The smoldering ruins of your village, the overturned carts, the shattered hearths, the remnants of lives that once felt ordinary, secure, and certain. At 17, you should be learning to tend flocks, spin wool, or prepare for the rituals marking passage to adulthood, but none of that will matter again. Your village, once a sanctuary, is now a tableau of destruction. Men in rough, dark leather and furs descend upon the shore, voices alien and guttural, their laughter sharp, predatory, echoing off the stones like the baying of wild dogs. Thick ropes cut into your wrists as you are dragged forward, the salt spray of the sea stinging your eyes. Every step a reminder of how small and powerless you have become. Behind you, smoke curls into the sky, a grim column marking the funeral pyre of your childhood, a home reduced to ashes, your family torn apart or slaughtered. Every familiar face, every comforting sound, is gone. You are no longer a daughter, a sister, or a friend. You are a possession, a prize, a token of conquest. And this, horrifyingly, is just the beginning. The Viking Age, stretching from the late 700s through the mid-11th century, is often romanticized as an era of adventure and discovery. Longships skimming across the waves, warriors adorned in elaborate armor, and tales of daring raids on distant lands. We remember Lindisfarne, the dramatic coastlines of Ireland, the bustling trade centers of England, the bold voyages to the North Atlantic, the eventual settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even hints of inland across the ocean. We think of sagas, poems, and myths celebrating feats of courage and exploration, a culture defined by strength and cunning. But behind these heroic images lies a darker, less told story, one of systematic terror, organized exploitation, and a trade in human lives so pervasive it shaped the very fabric of Norse society. The raids that appear to us as random violence were rarely chaotic. They were carefully orchestrated campaigns, backed by chieftains and syndicates, funded with silver and supplies, executed with tactical precision, and motivated not only by wealth but by a deeply entrenched social and economic system that saw women as commodities. First and human beings second. The mechanisms of this system were methodical. Consider the longships themselves, marvels of design, capable of navigating treacherous open seas while also sliding silently up shallow rivers to strike deep into inland territories, often far from any warning of an attack. These ships were outfitted for efficiency in raiding and in transporting captives. Timber was sourced with care, nails forged in iron, sails woven from durable wool, seams sealed with pitch to resist storms. Provisions were carefully calculated to sustain a crew and their human cargo over weeks at sea. Investors in the venture, wealthy chieftains or merchant partners, demanded returns, and the most dependable of these were not precious metals or livestock, but living people. The economy of fear relied on the systematic capture of women, young, strong, or strategically valuable. They were seized not as collateral damage of conflict but as targets. Their enslavement planned long before the longships cut through the waves, across the coasts of Britain, Ireland, the Scottish Isles, and stretching eastward into Slavic lands. The evidence of this practice is overwhelming. Monastic annals, carefully maintained despite the threat of attack, repeatedly mention great hosts of women carried away after a raid. The terse phrasing belies the horror implied. These women were stripped of names, identities, and agency. From daughters to mothers, from noblewomen to commoners, all were vulnerable once the raiders struck. The law codes of Scandinavia codified their status. Thralls, or slaves, were defined alongside livestock, their value recorded meticulously for trade or sale. Their lives were not their own. Their labor, their bodies, and even their children could be claimed as property. The Norse economy, the sagas, the wealth of settlements all rested on these enforced labor networks. The seeming romance of Viking conquests, longships cutting through waves, and warriors' tales of glory, was underwritten by suffering that rarely appears in popular imagination. And yet, it is precisely the human toll that reveals the age most clearly. The moment a woman was captured, her descent into bondage began. She was marched for miles, often in freezing weather, ropes cutting into her wrists, shackled alongside others taken in the same raid. Hunger gnawed at her belly, the wind tore at her hair, and the cries of the wounded and dying were constant companions. When the longships appeared on the horizon, they were not vessels of adventure but of terror. Women were crowded into the hold, a space scarcely larger than a barn floor, alongside armed men and stolen goods. The voyage itself was deadly. Exposure, disease, and despair took their toll, claiming lives before the ships even returned to a market where the captives would be sold, scattered, or conscripted into labor. Historians, archaeologists, and foreign observers provide stark corroboration. Arab envoys like Ahmad ibn Fadlan documented the slave trade on rivers stretching into the east, describing how captives were displayed, sold, and sometimes used in ritualized ceremonies that blurred the lines between domination, religion, and exploitation. Monastic chroniclers in Ireland and Britain noted repeated raids and the systematic capture of women, often highlighting their names or social status only to illustrate the wealth gained by the raiders. Archaeological evidence from skeletal remains, showing malnutrition and repetitive labor injuries to graves, containing both free individuals and thralls, speaks in a mute but piercing language. These were human lives, stripped bare, reduced to property, yet essential to the functioning of Norse society. This is not abstract history. Imagine being that 17-year-old girl, the wind lashing your face, the screams of your home echoing behind you, and knowing that every measure of comfort and familiarity has been replaced by chains, forced labor, and constant fear. Imagine that your world, once familiar and ordered, has transformed into a system where your body, your labor, and eventually your children, are tools to serve someone else's wealth and social prestige. The romanticized tales of Viking bravery, the longships, and the epic raids cannot erase the terror, the planning, and the systematic cruelty that underpinned them. It is a sobering truth. The Vikings, celebrated for exploration and skill, also perfected the machinery of human domination, and the women taken in their raids bore the brunt of that cruelty. Once the longships reached their destination, the nightmare intensified. The women who had survived the grueling sea journey, often days or even weeks, at the mercy of wind, waves, and disease, were thrust into a new reality: life as a thrall. They were no longer individuals with names, families, or futures. They had become property, legal objects in a system that codified every aspect of human bondage. Norse law was clear. A thrall could be beaten, sold, or killed at the whim of her owner without any consequence. She was catalogued alongside oxen, sheep, or grain. Her labor, her body, and even her reproductive potential were counted as part of the household's wealth. These were not rare exceptions. They were the rule. Entire economies depended on this system, from the far reaches of Scandinavia to newly conquered settlements in Ireland, Scotland, and Eastern Europe. The labor of women under bondage kept the engine of Viking society running. The daily life of a female thrall was an unrelenting cycle of work and fear. Dawn came with no reprieve, the cold air cutting through their bodies as they hauled water from icy streams, tended the hearth, and prepared meals for a household that treated them as tools rather than human beings. They ground grain for flour, using heavy cornstones, their knuckles raw, their backs stiff with the strain. Wool was washed in frigid rivers, carded, spun, and woven into the coarse, dense vadmel fabric that formed the backbone of Norse clothing, blankets, sails, and trade goods. Their hands bore the evidence of endless toil, calluses, cuts, and abrasions, hardened by work that demanded both strength and endurance. Archaeology confirms the toll. Skeletons of likely thralls show stunted growth, malnutrition, spinal deformities, and joints worn by repetitive labor. The physical suffering was compounded by emotional torment, isolation, the absence of family, the uncertainty of the future, and the constant threat of punishment hung over every movement. But work was only the beginning of their suffering. Sexual exploitation was not a side effect of slavery. It was baked into the system. Enslaved women had no autonomy. The law granted complete authority to their masters, who could use their bodies whenever and however they chose. There was no room for protest, no legal protection, no recourse. The concept of consent, as we understand it today, did not exist for thralls. Sagas and later Icelandic records speak plainly of Efrar, enslaved concubines, who were taken to bear children or satisfy the desires of their masters. These unions were not secret or scandalous. They were normalized, expected, and codified in social practice. Children born to enslaved women inherited their mother's status, ensuring that bondage could persist across generations. Free wives might live in the same household, forced to navigate the uneasy dynamics created by their husbands' thralls, while the women themselves endured constant physical and emotional violations, trapped in a system that recognized them only as property. Markets were hubs of cruelty as well as commerce. Thralls were displayed, inspected, and sold like livestock. Arab envoys such as Ahmad ibn Fadlan, traveling along the Volga River in the 10th century, documented the harrowing reality of these markets. Women were arranged in rows for evaluation, their strength, health, and even beauty assessed openly. The act of selling a human being was a performance, a demonstration of mastery and control over another life. Some captives were purchased for labor, others for sexual servitude, and some, tragically, were destined for ritualized deaths meant to honor a deceased master in the afterlife. One such account describes a 10-day ceremony in which a young female thrall, dressed in finery and plied with alcohol, was coerced into performing sexual acts for senior retainers before being killed alongside her deceased master, a harrowing example of normalized brutality and the complete subjugation of enslaved women in Viking society. Life under these conditions was a continuous exercise in survival. Even simple tasks carried immense risk. Failing to complete work, a mistake in weaving or food preparation could result in violent punishment. The cold, wet climate of northern Europe amplified suffering, as thralls labored outdoors in freezing conditions, exposed to wind, rain, and snow. Many died young from exposure, disease, or exhaustion. Those who survived lived with constant reminders of their vulnerability. The ever-present guards, the ropes and chains that could bind them at any moment, the knowledge that their children would inherit their bondage, and the understanding that their bodies in labor were not their own. The psychological impact was immense. Fear, despair, and trauma shaped every day. Some scholars suggest that this kind of systemic oppression created deep, intergenerational trauma, as the memory of raids, capture, and servitude was passed through stories, songs, and the very genes of descendants. The scale of this system is staggering. Coastal settlements, river hubs, and cities like Dublin, Hitteby, and Birka served as nodes in a vast network of human trade. Women could be moved hundreds, even thousands, of miles from their homes, from Britain to Ireland, across the Baltic to Scandinavia, and even eastward along the rivers of modern-day Russia and Ukraine. Eventually, reaching markets as far as Baghdad or Constantinople, captives were bartered for silver, spices, or textiles, traded like merchandise across continents. Every transaction, every forced march, every auction reinforced the systemic dehumanization of women, creating a society where human life was a commodity as essential to the economy as timber, furs, or grain. Yet some women's stories hint at resilience, cunning, and survival. Certain thralls learned to navigate the dangerous dynamics of their households, earning small mercies, temporary freedom, or influence within their limited sphere. A few high-status captives, princesses, or daughters of kings might be used as bargaining chips for ransom. Their lives precarious but slightly less brutal than the majority. But for the overwhelming majority, there was no escape. They labored from sunrise to nightfall, endured abuse, and faced sexual exploitation. Their identities erased and their autonomy stripped away. Even in death, some were sacrificed to serve their masters in the afterlife. Their bodies literally bound to property that outlived them. Archaeological finds, from multi-individual graves to decapitated retainers, confirmed that these practices were widespread and accepted within Norse society. And yet, despite this pervasive cruelty, the Viking Age is often remembered in popular culture as a period of adventure, exploration, and heroic sagas. The truth is far more complex, darker, and morally unsettling. For every longship sliding across the waves, for every raid chronicled in saga and song, countless women lived, suffered, and died in service to the ambitions of warriors and chieftains. Their stories are the silent ledger of Viking expansion, the hidden costs behind every conquest and settlement. They remind us that history is not only about glory, but about suffering, resilience, and the human consequences of societal structures that prioritize power and wealth over empathy and justice. The legacy of the Viking Age is far more than longships, epic raids, and heroic sagas. Beneath the surface of exploration and conquest lies a history of systematic oppression, domination, and human suffering, particularly that of women seized in raids. For these women, the consequences of capture reverberated not just through their own lives, but across generations. Children born to thralls inherited the same chains, ensuring that bondage extended across time, entrenching social hierarchies and perpetuating a cycle of exploitation. Even as Vikings settled new lands, established colonies in Iceland, Greenland, and the North Atlantic, or integrative conquered territories in the British Isles and Eastern Europe, the labor bodies and reproductive capacity of enslaved women fueled the growth of these settlements. Their toil was not ancillary, it was central to the survival and expansion of Norse society. Without their labor, textiles would not have been woven, hearths maintained, food prepared, and longships provisioned. The wealth of settlements, the silver and amber traded across Europe, the very ability of the Norse to project power across seas and rivers all depended on a foundation built upon human suffering. Genetic evidence underscores this stark reality. Modern studies of Iceland's population, meticulously documented through genealogical records, revealed that the majority of Y chromosomes, the male lineage, trace back to Norse settlers. Yet more than 60% of maternal lineages originate from Gaelic lands, primarily Ireland and Scotland. The implications are chillingly clear. Scandinavian men transported women from conquered territories, often against their will, to bear children and populate colonies. These women became the mothers of a new nation, yet they arrived under duress, their autonomy stripped away, their identities erased. This genetic footprint is an indelible record of the Viking system of human trafficking, reflecting a large-scale forced migration that shaped the demographic and cultural landscape of the North Atlantic. Every modern Icelander carries, in part, the legacy of women whose labor and lives were forcibly integrated into the Norse world. The cultural impact was equally profound. Thralls were woven into households not merely as laborers but as symbols of status and wealth. A chieftain's prestige could be measured by the number of enslaved individuals under his command. The sagas themselves, while often glorifying feats of bravery and conquest, reveal a society where slavery and subjugation were normalized, almost invisible within the narrative. While free women were protected by laws, fines, and social codes, thralls had no recourse. Their suffering, so integral to the functioning of society, was largely invisible in the historical record, overshadowed by tales of heroic exploits and maritime mastery. Yet the fragments that survive, skeletal remains, runestones, legal texts, and foreign eyewitness accounts paint a harrowing picture of the scale and systemic nature of oppression. Human lives were commoditized, labor and bodies exploited, and the social order relied on a ruthless calculus in which some people were valued only for what they could produce or endure. Even when the opportunity for ransom or elevation existed, it was limited and exceptional. High-status, captives, princesses, daughters of nobles, or women associated with religious institutions might be detained as pawns to extract wealth, negotiate alliances, or secure political concessions. Their lives, while slightly more secure than the majority, were still bound by uncertainty, fear, and the knowledge that their autonomy was dependent entirely on the will of others. For the vast majority of women, there was no escape from the relentless cycle of labor, sexual exploitation, and the constant threat of punishment. Archaeological evidence of graves containing multiple individuals, some decapitated or buried alongside free persons, hints at the ritualized and normalized nature of these deaths, reinforcing that life, and often death, were controlled entirely by the whims of masters. Even within the household, thralls were invisible, yet indispensable, laboring to sustain the wealth, prestige, and expansionist ambitions of their owners. This brutal system endured because it was effective and integrated into the economy, law, and social customs. Slavery and the seizure of women were not marginal activities. They were engines of power and prosperity. Every longship that cut through the waves, every raid chronicled in the annals of monasteries, every saga that glorifies conquest, rests upon the labor and subjugation of women whose stories rarely reach the pages of history. The Norse worldview accepted these practices as a natural and unremarkable part of life, illustrating how societies can normalize extreme inequality and exploitation when it is intertwined with economic and political incentives. This is perhaps the most important lesson from the Viking Age, that the machinery of domination can operate efficiently, quietly, and with broad societal consent, even while leaving indelible scars on the lives of those who are enslaved. And yet, there were moments of resilience and survival that shine through the darkness. Some women adapted, learned to navigate household hierarchies, or found small spaces of agency within oppressive circumstances. Some were eventually ransomed or freed after years of rarity that stood out precisely because freedom was so unusual. These stories, fragmentary and scattered, revealed the human capacity to endure, even when the odds are overwhelmingly against survival. But the overwhelming majority of lives were consumed by forced labor, sexual subjugation, and the relentless demands of a society that saw human beings as tools for wealth and status. Even in death, some were bound to their masters through ritual sacrifice, reinforcing the totality of domination that marked the era. Understanding the Viking Age fully requires confronting these uncomfortable truths. Longships and sagas may inspire admiration, and the courage of warriors and explorers cannot be denied. Yet the foundations of this society, the labor bodies and suffering of enslaved women, cannot be ignored. They were integral to the economy, the expansion of settlements, and the social hierarchy. Every raid, every conquest, every settlement relied upon their toil. The enduring genetic imprint, archaeological evidence, and historical records all testify to this hidden reality. The romantic image of the Viking as a free, adventurous spirit is incomplete. It is inseparable from a system that exploited the unfree on an enormous scale. That to fully appreciate the era, one must hold both truths in mind: the remarkable skill, innovation, and daring of the Norse, and the immense human cost on which these achievements were built. Women taken in raids labored, suffered, and were often silenced. Yet their contributions, coerced as they were, sustained settlements, fueled trade, and shaped the population of future generations. Recognizing their stories does not diminish the accomplishments of explorers or warriors. Rather, it adds depth, nuance, and honesty to our understanding of history. It reminds us that power and freedom are never absolute in a society structured around domination, and that behind every tale of conquest lies a shadow world of suffering and exploitation. If you found this exploration eye-opening and want to uncover more hidden truths from history, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. There are countless stories that textbooks ignore, sagas gloss over, and museums barely touch, stories that reveal the dark, complex, and often uncomfortable truths about our shared past. By subscribing, you join us on a journey through history's shadows, where the real stories, unvarnished and raw, finally come to light.